The fact that Mr. Putin, to pull off Victory Day, had to bring in his own human shield in the form of Xi Jinping from China. It was very well put, very loudly put to the Ukrainians by Beijing that the big boss is coming to Moscow. Moscow, don't you dare think of striking. That shows you how fearful he is, because it is assumed that there are Ukrainian special forces in Russia, and that they're the ones who've been carrying out these very, very brazen attacks, including in daylight, against senior figures in the Russian government or Russian military, especially. And then, I know a big topic here at the Black Sea Security Forum will be, for example, drone technology and how it's involved, and the ability of Ukrainian attack drones, strike drones, to penetrate far into Russia and hit strategic targets.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Michael Bociurkiw, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, former spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he's also an author and journalist speaking on many international media outlets about a series of topics on the world stage, especially Ukraine and Russia's invasion. Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good to be back with you after a little bit of a break there.
Well, Donald Trump has issued another deadline, 2 weeks for Russia to agree to a ceasefire or come to the table and do some sort of meaningful negotiation. Does anyone in Ukraine believe that?
No one that I've met. Meaningful negotiation, well, that has a very wide definition. We know what the definition is from the Russian side, is that they will send probably as low-level a delegation as possible. They will talk about all sorts of technicalities. They will put forth a list of demands that, as I've said before here, no Ukrainian president can ever agree to. I mean, basically, Ukraine is going to face off against a side that doesn't even believe in its existence, that wants it to be a failed state, or part of this former Soviet Union again. So how can possibly meaningful negotiations take place from there? If the talks are going to be happening in Turkey, President Erdogan and his circle of very talented diplomats have very little patience for wasting time. So I'm glad that's the chosen venue. I'm glad the Turks are going to be there, because I think they will steer things along. As for Mr. Trump's influence over Russia, it seems to be really waning. Having said that, I think in the time we've not done a couple of recordings, we're getting a little bit more insight into his twisted thinking. But it does look more and more that Mr. Trump is motivated by this odd fascination of Russia and its economy, that somehow if relations between the US and Russia are going to be reset, that it's going to make a huge difference in the US economy. Well, fact of the matter is that the Russian economy has deteriorated to the point where it's basically the size of the Netherlands. I think their growth rate is around 0.5% or something like that. A fraction of what it is in Poland. So Mr. Trump wanted to do economic deals. He should look no further than Poland and stop wasting his time with trying to reset relations with Russia, because that's exactly what the Kremlin wants.
And is there any confidence in the sort of building opposition to Russia in the Republican Party outside of the White House? I mean, there has been this warning about sanctions repeated today by the US at the UN, threatening these 500% third-party sanctions or tariffs. Are the Kremlin going to be worried about those new sanctions yet?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Russia was one of the very few countries that weren't slapped with any tariffs. Meanwhile, some countries 40, 50% plus. Look what the United States has done to what was its best ally, Canada. It's absolutely horrific treatment on all sorts of fronts. So, I think there is a set of grown-ups in the room, if you will, on the Republican side, especially in the House and the Senate. But there's still a huge fear of going against the White House, of offending Mr. Trump. At the end of the day, he's ruling by executive order, and the courts and the legislative branches don't seem to matter that much to him anymore. But I can tell you that among especially the Ukrainian diaspora, there's gaping mouths about the, let's call it deafening silence coming from Republican leaders on Ukraine. This is a party which traditionally has been defending Ukraine, that traditionally has been very, very anti communist and against Russian aggression. And we're hearing crickets. That is a very, very worrisome development.
And perhaps just as worrying is the noise that has come out of the White House. I mean, you mentioned there that there's this almost breakdown in belief between well, all three parties here. Is there a fear maybe that Trump has slightly burnt the US's credibility at this point, even if they were serious about these
Yeah,
tariffs?
absolutely. I've just come from around the world trip, and much of that was spent in Asia Pacific. And wherever I went, whether it was in Thailand or Vietnam this time, you do really, really feel the void, the lack of US kind of influence there. But you also see China making great strides to build up its relationships with countries such as Cambodia, where there's joint activities for a very impressive upgraded naval base there. So, I was at a Atlantic Council dinner the other night on the way here in Moldova, and we talked a lot about the current situation. And when I just came back from Asia Pacific, and I said that, you know, if it were the old days where the United States still had a lot of influence, whether it's through exercise of soft power or exercise of, its strength, perhaps even threat of military strength, the current conflict between India and Pakistan would have never have reached the level it has, the scary level it has. And I brought up the example too of kind of the US engagement, of which we were all very, very fond of in the old days. I remember when President Biden was vice president, and he traveled to Kiev, and he appeared in Parliament and said, "Okay, guys, my flight is leaving in a few hours. I expect you to pass this anti corruption legislation before I board my flight." And they did. And that's the way US power worked. It sometimes had to be by stick, but that's what's really missing these days. And then finally, on this point, and this is exactly the situation, the void that autocrats like Mr. Putin absolutely adore, where there are no solid red lines being enforced by the United States. All they see is gray lines, and that's what we're seeing playing out here on the ground in Ukraine, day after day after day. Kharkiv was especially hard hit, and now just in the past few hours, Zaporizhia, I believe, where the lights have gone off in half the city, and yeah, it's pretty bad, not only here but around the world with this pullback of U.S. engagement.
And as you say, that there have been, there are these ongoing strikes across Ukraine as well. I believe your hometown of Odessa was hit again overnight. How serious is the threat of strikes there, and how have you noticed that change living there? Even since the Trump administration has come in.
Yeah, I'm at today is the first day of the Black Sea Security Forum where I'm at, and there was meant to be a tour of the port on Sunday, I believe, which we're all looking forward to get a briefing on what exactly is going on. But that had to be canceled because of security concerns. But what happened recently is the Russians struck at the container side of the port. And that is very, very worrisome to me because, as you said, yeah, I've been living here, and I walk by the port every day, which allows me the luxury of seeing the most minute changes. And what I've been seeing over the past few weeks is very, very encouraging. Is for the first time since the start of the war, they're getting the container side going, because up until now it's been mostly bulk carriers coming in, staying for 3 or 4 days, loading mostly grain and taking it to world markets. But because Ukraine's roads and railway system are so stressed by the war, they've decided to take the very sober decision and start getting the container port going again. And they were building it up, building it up. I saw some smaller container ships coming in to pick up loads, and then a missile struck right there. I don't know how much work there is to rehabilitate that, but in a way, the damage has already been done, because when you do that, it scares the living daylights out of insurance companies, those who provide risk coverage, ship owners, And the Russians know exactly what they're doing when it comes to that sort of thing.
And I want to come on to that and the conference you are at the moment
Hmm.
in a moment. But just finally on those Russian talks, Russia, as we said, has agreed to come to the table in Turkey, Istanbul, on Monday.
Yeah,
Uh, is there anything we should expect from those talks? I mean, given the last meeting in Istanbul only recently, and the fact that
yeah.
the details of this supposed peace negotiation are quite scarce at the moment as well, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, let's remember that at the last talks they did walk out of the room with the agreement of having the biggest prisoner exchange since the start of the war, 1,000 on each side, and that has such a positive effect here in Ukraine when these men, many of them very gaunt looking, many of them showing signs of torture, isolation, and so on, come back home, and that of course impacts a lot of families here. These are what we used to call in the OSCE confidence building measures. When these things happen, at least shows that the two sides can agree on something substantive, but we need a lot more of that. We're talking about two sides with a lot of hatred towards each other, well deserved hatred from the Ukrainians to the Russian side, considering all the war crimes committed here and other damage. But we it needs to go further than that. And the reason I say that, sitting here in Odessa, is I mean, Odessa is the center of entrepreneurialism here in Ukraine. It's where stuff happens on the business side. Big deals are made. It's an international city, and I believe with your colleague Kate, we talked about this already a few months ago, that again, living here and seeing these subtleties, you start to see what's going on between the cracks. And the main thing that I see are good people leaving for the first time or thinking of leaving, thinking of moving their parents, thinking of selling their properties. And, it makes me really sad. I almost want to tear up, but, whenever I come back here, I look around and I'm going, where are my friends? It's not like they've abandoned me, but some of them are in London, some of them are in Boston, elsewhere. And they say we just can't take it anymore. The daily air raid sirens, the alarms, they're having to run for bomb shelters. We've held on for as long as we can, but it's getting really, really tough. And when that kind of creme de la creme, the movers and shakers of the city start to leave, that's worrisome. Now, let's see what happens at this conference, because a lot of that will be discussed here. But the point I wanted to make here is that this is the talks have to start producing some kind of peace where, number one, people will stay here, though they can see the end of the war, and secondly, the millions who have left and settled in places like Germany and Poland and farther afield will start to come back to rehabilitate the economy. The big thing you see here right now also is an enormous manpower shortage. Even the most respected NGOs, the UN, are having problems hiring people because um, a lot are at the front line, people are volunteering, but a lot have left. And I know there's a lot of, American Chamber of Commerce, Ukraine is open for business, come and invest. But if you come and invest here and you want to open up a factory, who's going to actually work there? So this is why I'll just briefly end this by saying, remember when COVID started, it was scary, right? Because we couldn't see the end of it. It freaked everybody out. And it's kind of, I compare that to kind of the war right now, is when you can't see an end to it, you cannot make long term plans, especially if you're a business person. It causes a whole set of very, very difficult problems.
And this presumably is going to all be being discussed at the Black Sea Security
Yes.
Conference that you're at the moment and across this weekend. What can you tell us about this conference and its importance for
Sure.
Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it was started a couple of years ago now by Oleksiy Goncharenko. He's an opposition MP, but he's one of the most vocal, one of the most energetic. I don't think the guy even sleeps. He works 24/7. He has a center, a network of um, humanitarian centers across Ukraine, which help especially displaced people. They do incredible things in these centers. And he started this to bring more attention to not only Odessa, but this Black Sea region and how strategic it is. I don't mean to give my over credit myself for anything, but I've noticed in the time I've been here, and the lives or the recordings I do with Times Radio and with many others, it brings attention to Odessa. Oh, Michael's there. It has to be it has to have some kind of importance. But it's allowed me to talk about the port, to talk about these subtleties that I see every day, and that's what these types of conferences do as well. There'll be, for example, more focused discussions on the role of Romania, on the role of Turkey, on the investment that is needed to rehabilitate the economy here, especially the military side. There are some side trips, for example, to the front, to a drone factory. It's bringing the world back to World City Odessa, really, at the end of the day, reminding people of the enormous potential here. And Lord Ashcroft, very well known in the United Kingdom, he's a big backer of this conference. One of the speakers is Mike Pompeo, the former U.S. Secretary of State. It'll be very interesting to see what he has to say, especially about perhaps insights into the Trump mind and what his strategy is towards Ukraine. There's also a big contingent here from the Atlantic Council, John Herbst, the head of the Eurasia Center, but also a name a lot of people will recognize, William Taylor, the former Ukrainian ambassador the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Of course, he became even more prominent when he testified on Capitol Hill on the quid pro quo scandal. We almost forgot about it, haven't we? When Donald Trump tried to pretty much blackmail President Zelensky, saying, okay, if you don't give me dirt on Joe Biden, no weapons for you, sweetheart. So, he's here. And I rewatched part of his video when he testified on Capitol Hill, and it's hard to think of anybody else who can speak as authoritatively and as passionately on why the world, but especially America, needs to support Ukraine. And his big takeaway line, of course, is if President Putin is not stopped, he will go further. So finally, here in Odessa, um, a lot of people will agree with me that if the Russians somehow get it into their minds that they want to grab more territory, and by the way, they are grabbing more territory as we speak in the east, and it looks like they're preparing to grab some pockets of territory in the Kharkiv region. But if they come up to Odessa, it's game over for not only this part of the Black Sea region, but also Moldova. I I made the short drive between the Moldova border and Odessa yesterday, and I can tell you there's nothing that's going to stop an aggressive force from going in there. I was in Moldova. Most Moldovans agree with me that that's the one single thing they fear. And just quickly, if you go east of Odessa towards Mykolaiv Oblast, you'll see actually very impressive Ukrainian defenses that were built there mostly last year. So that side of it hopefully would stand up if, again, Putin were to see gray lines, not red lines, and try and grab Odessa. They would like nothing more than to make Ukraine a landlocked country by taking over the entire coastline and making it theirs.
And I do want to come on to the fear of a possible new ground offensive over this summer
Yeah,
in just a moment. But finally, on the Black Sea as well. I mean, it's often forgotten in part because Ukraine was able to win such a quite
yeah.
convincing and quite surprising a naval victory in the Black Sea. But it is still really a crucial part of this conflict, isn't it? The Black Sea.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's worth reminding people that virtually without any navy, the Ukrainians managed to destroy a huge proportion of the Russian Black Sea fleet to the point where they've had to redeploy their ships and submarines further away towards the Russian mainland. And now, of course, 3 years of war is an eternity in terms of war, and technology has developed to the point where, for example, yesterday here, when the air raid sirens went off, there was a Russian reconnaissance drone that came, and I said, "Oh, Jesus Christ, that's a harbinger of possible missile attack." So there's new technology that has evolved since then that allows them to penetrate defenses or overwhelm defenses. But yeah, and how many times do I have to scream at the top of my voice? Is that the Odessa port, just a few hundred yards away from where I sit, is such a crucial part of the global food supply chain. And why is it? Why is it, I ask, that a small group of men in the Kremlin are able to decide whether, for example, families in Egypt can afford to eat bread? A lot of the bread in Egypt is made with Ukrainian grain, and other markets also, other countries on the brink of famine. And, one wonders why the West has not deployed the muscle that it has in the Red Sea to protect shipping lanes there from Houthi rebels, from Iranian or fire Iranian proxies, and not here in the Black Sea. Um, I think this will probably come up at the conference as well as what are some of the other military strategies as well. Because the other thing I learned in the past couple of days, or rather got a better appreciation for in Moldova, is how vulnerable the country is. It has virtually no military there. Of course, it has the Russian controlled Transnistria region, and then it has in the south an autonomous region. And much of the rural areas there are very poor. There, people there are susceptible to, you know, having their voting intentions twisted by Russian propaganda or Russian money. So it's, and we saw also what happened in Romania recently in the elections there. They had to be rerun because of Russian uh, uh, interference, massive interference via TikTok there. Huge stakes here. And finally, this is why Turkey, I think, knows that it has to play a role, especially in those talks, because they have such a stake, not only in Black Sea security, but they have huge economic stakes here in Ukraine. A lot of the, excuse me, early damage or destruction that was done in places like Bucha early on in the war. It was the Turks that came in because they know how to do it, and they're brave souls to come and fix bridges and roads and that sort of thing. So they're very, very interested. But again, I will emphasize this point: they're not into wasting time or being, portrayed as fools. They have to come away with something from these talks as well if they're going to replace the United States as the middleman.
And just this week, the EU has unveiled a new Black Sea strategy, largely looking at investing in military and civilian infrastructure around the Black Sea and in neighboring nations. Um, you know, how worrying do you think it'll be for the Kremlin that Europe has repeatedly seen that the Black Sea, they recognize the fact that the Black Sea is a good place to start if you want to provide more support to Ukraine,
Yeah.
but do so at an arm's length. You can avoid the idea of boots on the ground necessarily.
Yeah, yeah. Well put. And because you do have EU countries bordering the Black Sea, it's very, very important that Europe is there to help defend it. And the one thing I wish with the Europeans is that their leaders would stop coming here and taking selfies and then going back to their capitals, or we're going to defend Ukraine to the end. And a lot of them seem to think that sanctions are still the sharpest tool in the shed that they have. Well, I'm sorry, they're not. Um, Forget about sanctions having a short shelf life to begin with, but also that the Russians have become so experts, with the help of Chinese and others, to evade them, that it's just not going to tighten the noose in a way that we would think. Now, having said that, if a miracle were to happen and the United States all of a sudden were to become the world policeman again and put pressure on a country I was just in, Thailand, where the throughput of aviation parts through Thailand to Russia is going through the roof. Countries like Gabon had no aviation part export business before, but now they're gangbusters getting aviation parts to Russia, UAE as well. But the point I want to make is that if the U.S. and they are allies, very strong allies of Thailand, and the Turkey and the UAE, President Trump was just there, and we're to say, okay, guys, you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, you're allowing all of these Russians in. You're selling your luxury property to Putin's circle, allowing their yachts to be parked here. Uh, it's game over when it comes to that. We want to put an end to that, but we especially want you to stop being enablers of sanction busting by Russia. That would really, really tighten the noose. The other thing that has to happen, and this is related to security here in the Black Sea, because it would really put a powerful punch into the Russians, is that 300 billion in frozen Russian assets, sitting in Europe. I know proceeds from the interest have started to be used to help Ukraine, but the Russians have made it clear in their list of demands that forget about war reparation, boys and girls. In other words, Ukraine, we're not paying a cent. Now, that bill for damage to Ukraine infrastructure, including here in Odessa, is approaching $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. Take that 300 billion, 350 billion, whatever it is, put it in a Ukraine reconstruction fund, and that will go a long way to helping rebuild places like Odessa. Finally, the EU recognition that yes, support is really a great payoff here is because of what I said earlier about the importance of Odessa port. It does feed the world, and it's an important channel for Ukraine for its exports. Sunflower oil is a big one as well, not only grain. And, the Russians have also been striking closer to Moldova and the Danube River, where you have smaller ports there where smaller ships can come in, load up on grain, and then take it to Constantia in Romania, put it onto bigger ships there, and then they go to world ports. But they've also been striking infrastructure there. So the one thing I've been seeing happening there is more robust power distribution lines, but also hardening grain silos, things like that. So they'll make them more resilient to Russian attacks. All that is really, really important stuff.
And we've been talking a lot about Russian strikes on Ukraine, but even just this week, Ukrainian strikes not on anywhere in Russia, but on Moscow have been
Yeah.
increasing in intensity. There have been several this week on it's largely reported to be industrial sites on the
Yep.
outskirts of Moscow, but. Uh, Even then, this will be striking fear into the heart of the Kremlin, because even this week there has been a relatively high-ranking Russian figure who was killed
Yes.
by the Ukrainians. How much are people in the Kremlin going to be really worried about that?
Well, I'll give you a very vivid example. The fact that Mr. Putin, to pull off Victory Day, had to bring in his own human shield in the form of Xi Jinping from China. It was very well put, very loudly put to the Ukrainians by Beijing that the big boss is coming to Moscow. Moscow, don't you dare think of striking. That shows you how fearful he is, because it is assumed that there are Ukrainian special forces in Russia, and that they're the ones who've been carrying out these very, very brazen attacks, including in daylight, against senior figures in the Russian government or Russian military, especially. And then, the I know a big topic here at the Black Sea Security Forum will be, for example, drone technology and how it's involved, and the ability of Ukrainian attack drones, strike drones, to penetrate far into Russia and hit strategic targets. And the one you mentioned is an electronics factory that the Russians have been reportedly using to develop drones. Very important stuff. And this is also Ukraine kind of giving insurance to itself, if you will, an added layer of protection, because I know there have been talks. I was just updating myself a minute ago between Germany and Ukraine on those long range Taurus missiles, but it seems they're not going very well because there are cracks in the coalition. So it now seems that Germany instead will help the Ukrainians further develop their own capacities to build, for example, long range missiles and strike drones, which is exactly what needs to happen, because it will give it not only security for the time being, but long term security. And finally, the Ukrainians, my goodness, the telegram lights up like a Christmas tree whenever these strikes happen, or whenever all Moscow airports have to be temporarily closed because of unsafe skies. And this is exactly the Ukrainians going to the Russians and saying, okay, you want to strike us with impunity? We're going to give it back to you. We're going to bring this war to the doorsteps of Russians. And you know why they're hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Russians in Thailand right now, for example, the ones I've seen, is because they're fearful of being back home, either being forcibly recruited to fight at the front line, which is usually a one-way ticket, or further strikes in Russia. So it is having an impact.
And you mentioned there the extensions on the range that Ukraine is allowed to fire some of their Western missiles. That all came out, of course, during this
Yeah.
meeting in Germany between Zelensky and the Germans. How did you assess that meeting went?
Well, it could have gone a lot better. I tell you, there was one subtlety there. And you can go to my Twitter feed if you don't believe me. And that was President Zelensky switching up his fashion style a little bit and going from the typical fatigues that seem to have really set off Donald Trump to a more kind of stylish, uh, almost suit jacket. I don't know what's happening there, but that was interesting. He looked pretty dapper, I've got to say. But yeah, it there's still not the political will, it looks like. President Zelensky just said in the past few hours that there are certain things that him and Mr. Merz discussed that cannot be made public, and I suspect that's what it was. Look, we just don't have our ducks in a row at the moment to be able to give you those missiles. Better that we shift things around a bit and help you with your own domestic production. Now, even if the decision on the missiles were to happen, and I know it certainly generated a quick reaction from the Kremlin, that I was told by Atlantic Council experts it's not going to be a game changer for Ukraine. But the the kind of specific interesting thing about the Taurus missile is it's a very, very smart missile that it can be programmed to strike, inflict maximum damage underground into bunkers. Very, very impressive in that regard. And I think that sets it apart as well from the Anglo and the French missiles, which have a little bit smaller range as well. Uh, the other thing I should mention, and we're talking about weaponry right now, is more on the front line with the rapid escalation, especially from the Russian side of fiber optic drones. My good friend and colleague Yogita Lemay of BBC has just ended a tour of duty here. She did a very interesting report on how these drones actually work. But basically, you have kilometers of spooled of fiber optic cable on this drone, and it can fly a long way and really cause havoc at their front lines or in villages. But the thing about these drones is, unlike the previous ones, or unlike the $1 million drones that we operated as the OSCE special monitoring mission to Ukraine with very sophisticated cameras that were shot down, these drones are not susceptible to jamming, to GPS jamming. So, it can, for example, strike from the Ukrainian side a Russian tank with jamming equipment and inflict maximum damage. We saw a video of that the other day. But the Ukrainians are trying to catch up right now with production of those fiber optic drones. And the other thing that her and other reporting made clear is not only the lack of manpower at the front line, but also the lack of rotation. You have a lot of men there, and a lot of them are advanced age that haven't had a break for a long, long time because the capability to replace them just isn't there. So that also raises the point: is Mr. Zelensky going to order a wider mobilization, possibly including women, because um, you know they need fresh blood at the front lines, even to do things like operate drones. And I have to be careful what I say because I am living here, but the beach season is about to begin here in Odessa, and I remember walking around last summer shaking my head. Why are there so many able-bodied men packing the beaches when the fate of your country is at stake? Why aren't they being deployed? It's a controversial topic, and of course, most men cannot leave the country because of martial law. But when one asks is why isn't there a wider mobilization going on?
And the military threat, while Russia have not made significant advances this year so far, there is still that quite real fear of a new offensive over the summer from Russia, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, we're hearing now of this quite significant buildup of troops on the border with Sumy Oblast near Kursk. What feeling are you getting there about the fears of a Russian summer offensive?
Yeah, well, they're doing it by two ways. One is bombing Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, relentlessly. Just overnight, according to Telegram, Ukrainian media, a large bus depot, municipal bus depot, was struck. Uh, what the military civil significance of that is, I don't know. But it will affect, of course, public transport in Kharkiv, which is very, very important there. But yeah, Kharkiv is being hit very, very badly. But we're also hearing from respected military analysts that the Russians are building up to take pockets of the Sumy and Kharkiv region. Um, Whether it'll be a large one, we don't know, because if they were to do this, it would probably mean redeploying forces further south in Donetsk at the front line there, where they seem to be having quite a bit of success. Um, and they still have Ukrainian servicemen on Russian territory in the Kursk region, which they claim they're dealing with. So we're not so sure whether it's going to happen in huge numbers, but it must be causing concern in Kiev because, as I was saying, they do have a big manpower shortage. And to redeploy huge numbers of forces from the other parts of the front line to Kharkiv and Sumy would be a big problem for them at the moment.
Well, we will watch any further developments there very closely, and I'm sure be discussing them with you again soon,
You bet.
Michael. But thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for a membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.